You have probably been told at some point that if you were just honest enough, open enough, unguarded enough, people would finally love the real you. So you try it. You say the true thing instead of the easy thing. You let a silence sit instead of filling it with a joke. And what happens next is rarely the reunion you were promised. Often it's a flicker of discomfort in someone's face, a change of subject, a slightly cooler room. Nobody claps. From a Jungian perspective, none of this would be surprising. The mask you wear was never built to be removed casually, and the price of dropping it is almost never immediate love. It's almost always confusion, theirs and eventually your own. Think of the last time you softened an opinion before it left your mouth. Not lied, exactly. Just rounded off the edges so it would land more gently. Maybe at a family dinner. Maybe in a meeting. Maybe with a partner you've had the same argument with a dozen times. That small, automatic edit is not weakness. It's craftsmanship. Somewhere along the way, you built a version of yourself specifically engineered to be tolerated by other people, and it has been doing its job for years, probably since before you can remember learning it. Jung called this construction the persona, a word borrowed directly from the ancient theater mask, the face an actor held up so the audience knew which character they were watching. His point wasn't that the mask is fake in some shameful sense. His point was closer to the opposite. The persona is functional. It lets a surgeon stay composed in front of a frightened patient. It lets a parent hide exhaustion so a child doesn't absorb it. Without some form of persona, social life would be unbearable. Everyone broadcasting every raw impulse at all times, with no interface between the private self and the public one. The problem Jung was interested in was never that people have personas. It's what happens when a person forgets they're wearing one. The construction usually starts earlier than people assume, and it starts as instruction rather than choice. A child does not invent a persona out of nowhere. They notice, with startling speed, which feelings make a parent's face tighten, and which feelings make it relax. A burst of anger gets a certain kind of silence in response. A show of need gets a certain kind of impatience. Enthusiasm about the wrong thing gets mild embarrassment from an adult, who says nothing but communicates everything. None of this requires cruelty from the family involved. Most of it is simply what happens when one nervous system spends years reading another for signs of safety. By the time a person is old enough to reflect on any of it, the persona doesn't feel like something they built. It feels like their personality. Because in a sense, it was assembled before they had the tools to notice it happening. The exact shape of that early instruction is rarely identical from person to person, because different households and different cultures reward different things and punish different things. In one family, sadness is tolerated, but anger is not, so anger becomes the exiled material. In another, ambition is treated as arrogance, so ambition goes underground instead. Boys and girls are frequently handed different lists of acceptable feeling entirely. One side taught that need is embarrassing, the other taught that assertion is unattractive, and each grows a persona shaped precisely around whichever traits their environment could least tolerate. This is why two people can read the exact same philosophical idea and recognize completely different material in themselves. The persona is universal as a mechanism. What gets stuffed behind it is personal, almost like a fingerprint of what a particular household could and couldn't bear to witness. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. Most people don't experience the persona as a costume they put on. They experience it as themselves. The calm coworker who never seems rattled starts to believe she genuinely doesn't get rattled. The friend who always has the funny reframe for bad news starts to believe he genuinely isn't bothered by bad news. Over years, the distance between the performance and the performer collapses, and the mask stops being something worn. It becomes something inhabited. Jung thought this was one of the quieter tragedies available to a modern person. Not cruelty, not trauma, just a slow substitution, where the part of you built for public approval takes over the address where the whole self used to live. You can usually tell when this has happened to someone because of how they react to being told no, not screamed at, just mildly, ordinarily disagreed with. A person who is mostly persona tends to experience ordinary disagreement as an emergency because disagreement threatens the only self they have access to. Watch how quickly some people escalate a minor correction into a referendum on their whole character. That disproportionate reaction is usually not about the disagreement. It's about how little territory they have left behind the mask to retreat to. So, what happens to the rest of you? The parts that didn't make it into the acceptable version? Jung's answer was blunt. They don't disappear. They go somewhere. He called that somewhere the shadow, and it is probably the most misunderstood term he ever coined, mostly because people assume it means the evil twin, the secret monster, the thing you'd be arrested for. It isn't that, or at least not only that. The shadow is the collection of traits, impulses, needs, and capacities that never made it into conscious identity because they didn't fit the persona being assembled. It can include cruelty and appetite, sure, but just as often it includes your anger at being overlooked, your ambition that felt embarrassing to admit, your refusal to keep being useful to people who never reciprocated, your plain need to be left alone without producing an explanation for it. None of that is evil. It was simply inconvenient for the character you were playing, so it got written out of the script and sent backstage. The trouble is that backstage material doesn't stay quiet. You notice that whatever gets exiled from conscious identity tends to return sideways, as irritability that seems to come from nowhere, as an overreaction to something small, as envy you can't quite justify towards someone who has what you secretly wanted. Or it returns through projection. The exact fault you cannot tolerate in yourself becomes the fault you suddenly notice everywhere in other people. The colleague who is quietly furious about his own compliance will often be the first to accuse someone else of being fake. Not because he's lying, but because the shadow has to surface somewhere, and it is far easier to locate ambition, anger, or hunger in another person than to recognize it as your own. It's worth being careful here, because projection is easy to confuse with ordinary perceptiveness, and the two are not the same thing. Noticing that someone is genuinely being dishonest is observation. Feeling a disproportionate, almost personal contempt for a trait in someone else that has nothing to do with what they've actually done to you, that's usually the shadow speaking through a convenient target. The distinguishing feature is intensity, out of scale with the situation. Ordinary criticism has a ceiling. Projected material tends to be relentless, oddly specific, and strangely satisfying to repeat, because some part of the person doing it is finally getting to express what they were never allowed to feel about themselves. The shadow doesn't only surface as contempt for other people, sometimes it surfaces as attraction to them. It's a familiar enough pattern that it barely needs pointing out. The composed, dutiful person who keeps falling for someone reckless, or the guarded person who can't stop noticing the one individual in the room who says whatever they think. From a Jungian perspective, this is rarely coincidence. The exiled trait doesn't just leak out sideways as irritation. It can also draw a person toward whoever seems to be living the very quality they were never permitted to express. This is not usually a healthy foundation for a relationship, since admiring your own shadow in someone else is not the same as knowing them, but it explains a great deal about attractions that otherwise feel inexplicable, sudden, and slightly out of a person's own control. This is usually the point where the story people tell themselves gets it backwards. The common version goes, some people are simply authentic and free, and other people are simply performers and cowards. Jung's version is more demanding, because it applies to everyone, including whoever is watching this. The question was never whether you have a persona. You do. Everyone does. It's structurally necessary. The question is whether you still know where it ends and you begin. That distinction stops being abstract the moment the mask actually cracks, and it usually cracks in ordinary ways, not dramatic ones. You get passed over for something you'd quietly organized your whole identity around. Someone you extended real loyalty to disappears the moment you stop being convenient. You say the true, unpolished thing once, And instead of the relief you expected, you get distance. In each case, a version of you that had been running the show for years suddenly stops producing results, and you're left standing next to a stranger who happens to be wearing your face. Picture the specific moment instead of the abstraction. A dinner table, a question that used to get an automatic, agreeable answer. This time the answer is different, shorter, plainer, without the usual cushioning. For 3 or 4 seconds, nobody moves. A fork stops halfway to a plate. Someone changes the subject with slightly too much enthusiasm. Nothing was shouted, nothing was broken, but everyone at that table just watched a familiar character exit the stage without an understudy ready to replace them. Most people, understandably, try to patch the mask back on as fast as possible. They over-explain the honest thing they said. They apologize for having needs. They go back to performing calm they don't feel, because the alternative, sitting with whatever is underneath, feels like exposure with no floor beneath it. From a Jungian perspective, this is exactly the moment individuation is trying to begin, and exactly the moment most people, quite reasonably, run from it. That single moment at the table is easy to dismiss as a one-time slip. It isn't. The same pressure that built the mask in childhood keeps building new versions of it well into adulthood, and one of its most effective workshops isn't a family or a friend group at all. There's a modern version of this same pressure that Jung never had to describe, though his framework explains it without much strain. A curated profile is, in a sense, a persona with infrastructure, a version of a life assembled for approval, refined by which posts get warmth and which get silence, until a person can spend more hours maintaining the edited self than living whatever the unedited one would look like. The exhaustion people report after hours of scrolling isn't only about comparison to other people's lives. It's often the fatigue of constantly managing which parts of their own life are presentable. The mechanism is exactly what Jung described in the therapy room a century earlier, approval shaping which parts of a person get shown, just now running at a scale and speed no single family or village could have produced on its own. Away from a screen, the same architecture gets rebuilt using entirely different materials: a badge, a title, a desk. The same dynamic shows up at work, often with less drama and more consequence. An employee learns which opinions read as constructive and which read as difficult, which frustrations are acceptable to voice, and which quietly damage a reputation. Most workplaces reward a very narrow, composed version of a person, and over time, that version can start to feel like the whole of who they are, right up until a performance review, a layoff, or an ordinary disagreement with a manager reveals how much of their sense of self was actually on loan from a job title. None of this makes the professional persona dishonest. It makes it exactly what Jung described: useful, necessary, and dangerous only when mistaken for the entire person underneath it. Individuation was Jung's word for what happens if a person doesn't simply patch the mask and move on. Not a personality overhaul, not a dramatic reinvention, but a slow renegotiation of allegiance, where identity stops reporting primarily to the audience and starts reporting to something more internal. It is not the same thing as isolating yourself from other people, and Jung was fairly explicit about that, because he watched plenty of patients misread the process as permission to withdraw permanently, treating every disagreement as proof the world was beneath them. That isn't individuation. That's just building a colder, more elaborate persona, the mask of someone who needs no one, which is still a mask, and arguably a more brittle one, because it can't survive contact with actual intimacy. What individuation actually asks of you is less comfortable than either extreme. It asks you to let the exiled material back into the room. The anger, the ambition, the refusal, the appetite, not to act on all of it unfiltered, but to stop being ashamed of its existence and start deciding consciously what to do with it. This is where the shadow, properly integrated, stops being a threat and starts becoming information. Your disproportionate irritation at a particular kind of person tells you something real about an unclaimed part of yourself. Your envy points, with unsettling accuracy, at exactly what you've decided you're not allowed to want. Jung's clinical wager was that a person who can look directly at that material without flinching gains something almost nobody gets from performing wellness instead. They stop needing every room they enter to confirm who they are. There's a twist here that most people miss, because it runs against the assumption that the shadow is only where the bad material lives. Jung noticed the excluded material isn't only anger, cruelty, and appetite. Sometimes what got exiled was a gift, a capacity for joy that seemed embarrassing, a talent that would have made someone else in the family look smaller, ambition so genuine it felt like betrayal to people who prized modesty. He called this the golden shadow, and it complicates the entire premise of this video. The face behind the mask isn't only the part of you that would disturb a room, it might also be the part that would eclipse it. And that's harder to let back in than anger ever was, because reclaiming your cruelty at least confirms you were right to hide it. Reclaiming your brilliance means admitting you dimmed it on purpose, for people who never asked you to. You can watch this shift happen in small, almost boring behaviors, long before it becomes a personality trait anyone would notice from across the room. A disagreement lands, and instead of a flood of self-defense, there's a pause. An actual pause, not a performed one, before the response. Someone withdraws warmth conditionally, the way people do when you stop being maximally convenient. And instead of the old scramble to win them back, there's something closer to plain observation. I see what that warmth was actually for. Praise arrives, and it registers as pleasant rather than load-bearing. None of this looks like transformation from the outside. From the inside, it is the difference between a self that has to be constantly re-elected by other people's approval and a self that has already been quietly appointed. None of this arrives free of cost to existing relationships. Some people around you were never relating to the whole of you, only to the edited version that made you convenient. And when that version stopped showing up, the relationship often doesn't survive. This isn't always a tragedy. A friendship that only worked because you absorbed more than your share. A family peace that only held because you swallowed the same disagreement every year. These were never as stable as they looked. They were propped up by the very performance individuation asks you to stop giving. Losing them can feel like failure. It's usually closer to finding out which parts of your life were built on you and which were only ever built on your mask. The complication Jung kept returning to is that none of this is a single event you complete and coast on. The persona doesn't get retired, it gets demoted from ruler to tool. You'll still use it, at work, at a funeral, in front of a child who doesn't need your unfiltered exhaustion. What individuation changes isn't the mask's disappearance, it's that you remember while wearing it that it's a mask, chosen for the room, not confused for the self underneath. Lose that distinction, and you're back where the surgeon and the parent started, composed outside, absent inside, waiting for the exiled material to come knocking through irritation, envy, or a disagreement that suddenly feels like an emergency. And this is also where the process can genuinely go wrong, which is worth saying plainly rather than glossing over. Some people take the discovery of their shadow and use it as license, as if noticing your buried ambition or anger entitles you to unload it on whoever is nearby, unfiltered, and call that authenticity. Jung wasn't describing permission, he was describing responsibility. Integration means the anger gets acknowledged and then directed somewhere useful, not that it gets to run the meeting. A person who mistakes shadow work for an excuse to stop caring how their honesty lands has simply built a new persona out of bluntness, and it costs them the same thing the old mask cost: real intimacy, just from a different direction. There's a further complication worth sitting with, because it keeps this from collapsing into something too tidy. Integration comes with no guarantee of comfort, and no finish line. Some days the exiled material still wins, the irritation still gets misdirected, the envy still gets moralized into a complaint about someone else's character. Jung wasn't offering a cure, He was describing an ongoing relationship with the parts of yourself exiled early, one that has to be renewed, imperfectly, again and again, rather than solved once and filed away. Go back for a moment to that dinner table. The fork stopped midair, the too quick change of subject. What if the discomfort in that room was never really about the disagreement at all? What if it was the first flicker of something in you that had been dimmed for so long that nobody at that table, including you, remembered what it looked like at full brightness? So, the real transformation Jung was pointing toward isn't the moment you finally stop wearing any mask at all. It's the moment you notice, for the first time in years, that you are the one deciding which mask the room requires, instead of discovering, after the fact, which mask survived, and which brightness you finally let back into the room. That's a quieter kind of freedom than the one usually advertised, the one that promises total unmasking and instant belonging. It doesn't announce itself with applause, and it doesn't always feel like relief on the first day. But it means that the next time you round the edges off an honest sentence at a family dinner, or hold your tongue in a meeting, it will be a choice made by someone who remembers what's underneath, not a reflex performed by someone who has forgotten there's anything underneath at all. The next time a room goes quiet after you say something true, you won't need it to clap. You'll already know which one of you was speaking. If this changed how you think about the face you wear in a room, the next video goes further into what Jung actually meant by the shadow. Subscribe so you don't miss it.